Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We have an exciting episode today. I think we're going to talk about a terrestrial episode, but joining us is the guy behind all of the mixing, making our sound great, our podcast sound great. Danny Lindahl is in the booth with us. So
happy to be here.
Yeah, let's welcome him. And Drew, we're going to talk about a terrestrial episode. So I don't know, what do you guys have in mind for us today?
Well, Danny texted me on Saturday afternoon, I think. I didn't get back to him until Sunday, but he said, what about talking about dire wolves and extinction? And I thought, that's a really good topic for us to discuss, but it's also a topic where, like, if you're into all the sciencey stuff, it's hard to know what questions everybody might have. And so I thought it was a good opportunity for Danny to come in the booth with us and be a part of the conversation today.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. That's something that I've had conversations with people that are scientists, and it leads one way, and I've had other people that aren't scientists talk to me about it, and that goes a different way. So, well, welcome, Danny. We're excited to have you in the booth today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking with the dire wolves?
Yeah, I'm excited to provide just a perspective from somebody who knows nothing but reading headlines and seeing people talk about it. So I know almost nothing about like the background of everything. So.
Well, hey, many of the people I interact with, they would call you an expert. Then, if you've seen it on social media, it has to be real.
Absolutely,
right?
I believe everything you read on the internet.
Yeah.
So. From what the headlines have said, like the first immediate reaction was they're bringing back dire wolves. It's
right.
Full Jurassic Park. They went and found the DNA, and then they made the wolves, and now they've got dire wolves again, and they're this huge wolf. That's about all I know about dire wolves. Mm-hmm. And then there's the reaction from the other side that's like, actually, these aren't dire wolves at all. What they did is just, I don't know, spray painting a regular wolf and then called it a dire wolf. Maybe they found a big one. And there's just that huge, big reaction from both sides. And so I'm kind of, from what I understand, it's somewhere in the middle where they did some DNA editing to some extent, but maybe not enough to call it a dire wolf. And also, what even is de-extinction? Is that a thing? Is that good to do or anything like that? So I guess what happened? What did they actually do?
Yeah, well, I don't know some of the nitty-gritty details, so hopefully between Joe and I we can get most of it right. But from my understanding, they had some wolf pups that hadn't been born yet, probably fetuses or maybe even embryos, and they used gene editing technology to basically give them some genes that were similar to genes that make dire wolves appear the way that they do, from their color to their size and that sort of thing. I don't know the nitty-gritty, but ancient DNA is like really crappy stuff, and it's really hard to work with. Sometimes they have a hard time just even identifying a critter based on ancient DNA.
Yep.
So my guess is that they didn't actually take dire wolf DNA, let's say from a carcass that they found mummified in a glacier or something like that. I doubt they took that kind of DNA and then just stuck it into a wolf embryo. Tell me if I'm wrong, Joe.
No, I think you're right. The way that it's been described to me, gene editing, is, I think the analogy of a Lego set is really good. And so if we think about building an animal, it's kind of like building, Legos. So we're putting together all the different pieces, and the instructions are telling us what piece to put in what place in order to get a certain animal at the end of it. And what gene editing has done is say, okay, instead of blue eyes, we want red eyes. And so we're going to replace those certain Legos that would be blue with red Legos, or we're going to replace brown fur with white fur. And so if we think about doing that, most of the instruction manual is going to stay the same, but there's going to be little areas that we can copy and paste We're going to take out some of the areas that maybe have the most clear cut, make something look like another animal, and replace those with something that makes it look like something else. So really what they've done is go in and find little pockets where they can change the amount of fur or the fur color and replace just that little instruction part of the Lego set to create an animal that looks like a dire wolf, right? And so a majority of the genetic material that's still there would be of the source organism, which is a different a type of wolf that's still living, right? So
The gray wolf, right?
Yeah, gray wolves. And go ahead.
Sorry. So where is the line between that being isn't a species just how its genetics are expressed, or is there a difference between making the Lego set say something and just buying a different Lego set that already says that?
I think one of the big challenges is they've edited a couple of genes, right? And if you're of the mindset of what makes a species the expression of its genes, then it would be the entire genome.
Okay.
Right. So I remember when I was in an undergrad at K-State, or actually right before I think I was an undergrad at K-State, they figured out the human genome, and that was a huge deal because they've figured out all the different loci and what instructs different things to happen when within people and all that sort of stuff. And so we're not talking about one gene or one loci being expressed or two. We're talking about hundreds in order to actually reproduce that entire animal. It's probably thousands or millions or something like that.
Really high number.
Yeah, it's not. I was trying not to exaggerate because I've been accused of that before, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the number either, but I would guess that it is thousands or even hundreds of thousands, millions. It's a very large number, and I think that in this case, it's somewhere around 20 different areas that they went in and snipped out and kind of edited, what's being expressed in that animal that's coming out. So.
Okay. Just for reference, what can you tell me about dire wolves? Like, how big are they? What habitat? Why did they go extinct? Kind of, I guess, a Reader's Digest version of a summary.
Yeah, and I'm a mammologist, and I guess I'm a pretty poor mammologist because I don't know a ton of details about dire wolves. But during the last glacial maximum time, when we had ice ages that came and went and all those sorts of things, there were a whole bunch of these really, really big mammals that existed in North America. There were several different species of mammoths. There were mastodons. There were a couple of different horses. There were like 5 or 7 different species of really large cats that were all like bigger than lions and tigers. There were 2 different species of cheetahs in North America.
Wow.
That's why
I've seen Ice Age,
yeah.
So I know I'm locked in.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I don't mean to be telling you stuff you already know.
No.
but like sloth bears and dire wolves were one of those species, and they're much bigger than gray wolves.
How big could you ride one?
I don't know.
Are they as big as horses, or like?
I don't know.
I don't think they were that big. I think they were 1.5 times as big as a wolf. Kind of going from like a dog to a wolf might be a good analogy.
Okay.
But Drew might.
So maybe Great Dane height, Great Dane leg length, or something like that. Because a big gray wolf is going to be 150 pounds.
Okay.
So twice that size, 1.5 times that size.
Okay.
So you could probably ride one, but they wouldn't be like horse size.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You have to be friends with it first pretty well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. you'd have to be pretty tough and pretty confident in yourself to decide you're going to ride a dire wolf.
I don't know. I make friends with most dogs that I see, so I think I can handle it.
Yeah. But how many of the dogs that you meet and make friends with want to eat you?
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
And have been purpose bred to be as amicable as possible and everything. Yeah. So is the habitat, if it was during the Ice Age, right, and there's obviously entirely different than now, if we just had a dire wolf, like we just had one, there's no way that it would survive, right? There's no, do you think, is there any habitat for it?
Well, habitat's not the only thing that causes critters to go extinct.
That's fair. Yeah.
Right. There's lots and lots of different reasons. Habitat loss is absolutely one of those things. And I don't know for sure, but I think that the habitat loss that would be associated with the extinction of dire wolves would have had more to do with, there was such an extent of glaciers on the North American continent and maybe beyond. I don't know if they existed in Eurasia or not.
I don't know.
But as those glaciers shrunk and got bigger and everything, they would create these really, really isolated areas. And dire wolves may have just gone extinct because the area that was available for them during that time got so small. We have lots of the North American continent. We have lots of Eurasia, and even probably parts of the African continent that would be suitable habitat for a large carnivore like a gray wolf or even potentially a dire wolf. What kind of temperature extremes that species would be able to handle, I have no idea. But there's other things that go into it, right?
Yeah, the food chain and all that.
Well, the food chain, yeah. But what about social carrying capacity? What about social tolerance? So,
what do you mean, like making friends, or
no? Well, yeah, in a way. So
it is like Ice Age.
So if we think about the gray wolf as a surrogate species, right, a smaller species, but that is a big carnivore and preys on livestock.
Oh, they would fight.
Well, they might fight. They would be competitors, but gray wolves at a much, much smaller size are not tolerated very well by humans, right? If we've got areas that are really important for agricultural production, those areas are areas where it's really, really challenging to get wolves established and to maintain those populations because of what we would call social carrying capacity. So biological carrying capacity is the number of critters that an area can support, right? And not just the number of critters of species X that an area can support. Social carrying capacity is the number of critters of species X that society is willing to tolerate.
Oh, gotcha.
And then there's the other side of social carrying capacity, that is the number of critters of species X that a different sector of society who doesn't necessarily tolerate them but very much values them, how many do they want? And so social carrying capacity ends up being this balance between, let's say, how many gray wolves the people in New York City would like to know that there exist, even though they may never see them, versus how many gray wolves can the Colorado livestock producers support. And so my guess is that current habitat, if we were able to bring back actual dire wolves, not some genetic amalgamation of dire wolf traits and gray wolf traits, if we were actually able to bring back dire wolves, I would think that it would be pretty hard to get people to tolerate them, especially if they ended up having some aggression towards humans and all those sorts of things, because it's a big predator.
Yeah. The other thing I think is that if we could bring them back, one of the things we see is when we introduce a biological animal to situations, a lot of times they're brought in to help with control. And so we might bring in a species from another area that's not extinct, right? It just might not be endemic. It might not be a natural animal in that community. When we bring them in, a lot of times we think they're going to do one thing, and they end up spiraling and doing 2 or 3 or 4 other things that make the problem, a lot worse. And so it could be a situation where even if we did have the right habitat, we have the right, social, everyone's willing to bring them back. The farmers are willing to lose however much production they have to. Understanding the consequences of what we can't see, right, is something that we would need to value. And if we're talking, this is just dire wolves, but if we start to think about how many extinct species we might want to bring back, there's lots of implications of doing that.
Yeah.
Another side of it too is thinking about genetic diversity. So if you start creating something like an old species and trying to bring them back through just genetic modification, well, how many variations of that critter can you produce in a lab so that you've got enough genetic diversity out in the wild that they can maintain themselves without having inbreeding depression?
Yeah, I saw there was a video Hank Green made about this. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's an educator online. He's not a scientist, but he does a lot of like really deep research. He finds peer-reviewed stuff and does his best. And he was talking about the same company was doing something similar with red wolves too.
Well, and I don't know. There's now we're going to stray away from science and start thinking about ethics and those sorts of things, and that's probably a bad place to go. But just tell you where I'm at on this sort of stuff. Thinking about having a limited number of resources that can be invested in wildlife management, conservation of species, and all these sorts of things. To me, it makes more sense to focus on something that we can actually help.
Yeah.
Right. And there still exist. There are still red wolves in existence. So if somebody's going to work on this sort of problem, I'd rather see them work on red wolves than on dire wolves. Now, I know a lot more about red wolves than I know about dire wolves. One of the challenges with them is there's a whole group of carnivore scientists that think red wolves are just a hybrid between coyotes and gray wolves. And so are they actually a species? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not smart enough to know that. But that's a whole nother challenge. And one of the other things that I was thinking about when you started talking about that is that's one of the big challenges that they have with black-footed ferret recovery. Anytime we have a species that becomes endangered and gets to that level where maybe we think they're extinct, we haven't found one in 50 years, and then all of a sudden we find one, like with ferrets, it goes back to, I think it's either 11 or 17 individuals is all that was left. And so every black-footed ferret that's in existence now is a relative of that small of a bottleneck.
How many are there now?
I don't know. They've got a breeding program for them, a captive breeding program. They've released a whole bunch in the wild. There's a whole lot of challenges with that introduction effort or reintroduction effort. But there's challenges with all those sorts of things. But from my point of view, it's better to focus on something that still exists than trying to bring back something that doesn't.
When we get to those bottlenecks too, it might, there can be disease issues that come in, and it might be, multiple generations for humans. It might be 100, 200 years before we see that, but something, can come in. COVID is a great example where in the natural setting, something like COVID could crash a population, right? And so it might not make them go extinct, but it can, kind of reset them. And if you don't have a lot of genetic diversity, it makes you more susceptible, especially in the short term, but also it can be something in the long term that you see. I do think, we keep mentioning bringing back the dire wolf or bringing back the red wolf or the woolly mammoth, whatever we're doing. And again, I think it's important to reiterate that we're not bringing those animals back. We're making the species that we have look like those other species, right? And so it's not a dire wolf. It's a gray wolf that looks fluffy and looks like a dire wolf, right? So that is an important distinction to make.
So about the gray wolves that we have now, do we have any in Kansas? Do we have where are the gray wolves now? Because I've never seen one.
Sure. So there's a whole bunch up where your family's from, the Great Lakes region.
Okay. Minnesota.
Yeah, northern Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. That's an area where they've been very, very successful. So successful, in fact, that there were hunting seasons and trapping seasons opened in those states, and then those got halted by court injunctions from lawsuits, and that population is still considered protected. There's basically no harvest there. And then there's the Northern Rockies population, so Montana, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. That population started to trickle into northern Colorado. And then the voters in Colorado got a ballot initiative that passed that forced the state of Colorado to reintroduce gray wolves. Most of the heavy livestock producing states in the Northern Rockies refused to provide wolves as a source for those, and so though they had to look elsewhere. There are also some wolves in like Oregon, Northern California. There's a few wolves, and those are all what we would consider more like a timber wolf, gray wolf. There's one species of gray wolf, right? But then there's also Mexican gray wolves, and those have been reintroduced close to the Mexican border. There's some in New Mexico, Arizona, and down in that area.
Okay, so are there a lot of wolves, or are they? Seems like they're doing okay.
Yeah.
Right, as far as gray wolves.
Yeah.
There's plenty.
Yeah, there's plenty of them, but it depends on, we've got, and when we start thinking about animals that are regulated, then we start thinking about things like distinct population segments. So when we're thinking about regulation under the Endangered Species Act, there's the Great Lakes population of gray wolves. There's the Northern Rockies population. Probably Pacific Northwest. I don't know what that one's called out there in Oregon and stuff. Then there would be the Mexican gray wolf is separate. And then in Canada and Alaska, that population has always been intact. They've never really been in trouble. So they were the sources for a lot of the introductions. And then we haven't even talked about all the gray wolves that are still over in Eurasia. So yeah, there are a lot of gray wolves, but there are specific population segments that have been targeted for reintroduction they're still trying to grow them.
Mm-hmm. So what do gray wolves eat? They're predators, right? Do they eat? Is it a problem for livestock? Do they eat cows?
Yeah, well, they absolutely kill livestock. Yes, when we think about canids, the smallest canids eat almost nothing but mice and insects and that sort of stuff. Then you got coyotes, and coyotes are just incredible generalists. They eat insects, they eat small mammals, they eat rabbits, they eat some deer fawns, they kill a few adult deer, not very many, and they absolutely take some livestock. Gray wolves are bigger. They need more calories when they eat and that sort of thing, and they're much less of a generalist than coyotes are. And so, thinking about during pre-European settlement times, gray wolves in the plains followed herds of bison around. And they killed calves, they killed sick bison, the old and stuff like that. They killed deer. So they're absolutely bred, they're genetically programmed to take larger prey items, and livestock are included in that, and they can have a significant impact on livestock.
I think it's also important to point out that they serve an important function, right?
Yeah.
And so regulating all of the different trophic levels, there's a lot of research, Drew, you're probably a lot more familiar with it than I am, but shows that having wolves in certain areas causes cascading effects where you see things down to like the types of plants that are growing in an area changing because the amount of mice might change, and the types of birds, and even they've done studies that have shown that terrestrial changes like that can change the fish community and rivers and stuff. So the connections from having a predator in an area, they may cause problems if they're in the wrong area, but they can also be really beneficial and cause or lead to a lot of improvements back to changes that we wouldn't think of, right? So water quality changes in water. Who's going to think that a wolf can impact that, right? So
it's all really like a delicate balance. Wasn't there something with wolves in Yellowstone? What happened there?
Well, they went years and years and years with no wolves, and elk got overpopulated. And when the wolves rebounded after they were reintroduced, then the elk populations got down to more appropriate levels, and the elk had been over browsing all of the woody plants that were growing along the streams and that sort of thing. And so that's that trophic cascade Joe was talking about. Yeah. So once the elk numbers were reduced after wolves were reintroduced, then we started getting those willow communities and stuff like that growing back along the streams, and it totally changed the stream dynamics in that system. I was talking to some people just on Friday. They're from Wyoming, and we were talking about the coyotes that they had in their backyard here in Kansas. They've got two places, one in Kansas, one in Wyoming, and they've got a coyote right now that's acting aggressively toward their dog. And they said, we used to have coyotes in our yard in Wyoming, but now that there's wolves back, we don't have any coyotes because the wolves kill the coyotes. But now we've got wolves in our backyard. So that's another interesting interaction between trophic levels is within canid, you tend to have a canid that's species that's much smaller than I am, I don't worry about because it's eating small enough stuff that it's not a competitor. But the next size smaller than me, so if I'm a wolf, a coyote is a competitor, but it's a competitor that I can whip. And so we see this dynamic where coyotes kill foxes and wolves kill coyotes. And if we introduced a gray wolf that had those dire wolf characteristics, then we'd introduce this new situation most likely where these fake dire wolves are out there killing gray wolves. Yeah, like you were talking about, the unintended consequences that we don't think about.
Yeah, and I
Cascading
think
effects.
Cascading effects. But I think also like the pictures that we're seeing of this new quote unquote dire wolf, it's a puppy that's really fluffy and looks really friendly, right? That's not the implication, the total implication of everything. That's not a full grown, animal and all the effects that would come with that animal.
Hard to imagine that one eating a cow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Is there anything similar they're working on for fishery stuff? Is there any fish they're trying to recreate? I don't want to say bring back, but like
sure. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that. We tend to not have as much, fish aren't as fuzzy as much. They're not quite as cuddly. And so I don't know of any research that's directly related to the fish, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was, it would be, probably some sort of trophy fishery type deal where people wanted to go catch something that's big and pretty. So I don't know of any of that. There are other types of genetic manipulations that we do. And so if we think about breeding programs, it could be as simple as that, where we're going out and we're picking, the biggest fish to make offspring from, right? And so that the fish that you make offspring are called brood stock. And so we might go out and make sure we have really big, pretty fish. We want to do that. Largemouth bass are common. There's a Florida strain of a largemouth bass. It's, they're breeding them with peacock bass and making these really, really pretty big fish that they can fight and they look pretty. And so there are a lot of things like that where people are, we're manipulating the genetics either in a lab or, people are even doing it in their ponds on a much less sophisticated level. But, genetic altering is something that we've been doing for a really long time, right? I mean, if you go out and harvest peas, that was one of the studies that was done because it's relatively quick to get a bunch of peas, but you want to pick the biggest peas and you want to plant those so next year you get bigger peas or, whatever. In our gardens, we see it all the time, right? And so genetic manipulations, maybe manipulation's not the right word there, but working with genetics is something that we've been doing probably as long as humans have been around. We didn't realize what it was called at the beginning.
Yeah, look at pugs.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example of that, pug shouldn't exist. It's about every problem that there is. But
well, corn used to have a seed head that looked about like blue stem, Eastern gamma grass.
It just looks like a grass, right?
Similar.
Yeah, and now we're eating it, all the time. So that's just, genetic manipulations.
Is there any fish that if it was possible to bring them back Jurassic Park style, like the actual fish, is there a fish you'd want to catch or a fish you'd want to be able to add to an ecosystem or something like that?
Well, I don't think I'd want to add them to an ecosystem.
Yeah,
I think that goes against most of what I believe in. But there are some of those prehistoric sharks that are some pretty crazy animals, right? But we have a lot of crazy animals in the world today. So thinking about if I could go back in time and see dinosaurs or prehistoric fish or aquatic animals, if there was time travel, of course I'd want to do that. You'd have to be crazy not to want to go see it, but to want to bring those back to today, I think that we don't have the understanding, and I don't think it's possible for us to have the understanding to see all of the unintended consequences. So yeah. So, I mean, it would be fun to go back in time and be part of it all and see it all, but it's also, to me, it's we've all seen Jurassic Park. It's a scary movie for a reason.
Yeah,
right?
I was meaning like if there's a population of a pest or something that's out of control, but I guess there's just other fish that we can add that would take care of that. We don't have to make something new.
Yeah, well, that's a type that's called biological control, where we're adding a certain fish into an environment or a certain animal into the environment, and we try that, and generally that leads to more problems than it does. Again, we're trying to help a situation, but then things spiral out of control, and so gizzard shad are a fish that we add.
That's not a real fish.
You
made those words up.
Yeah, well, it sounds like
that's a turkey thing, and then a rock.
Yes, you're adding part of a bird and a rock.
Yeah, you're just making your own species now.
That's right. Hey, that's what we're doing. We're editing. We're gene editing here.
Gizzard
Danny.
shad.
There's another one called a threadfin shad.
Threadfin shad.
That sounds like a fish. Yeah. I believe you.
But you don't believe gizzard shad?
I don't believe gizzard shad. No. What does it look like?
Gizzard shad are you've probably seen a gizzard shad.
No.
Even if you're on around fish much, but they're a 1 or 2 inch little silver fish, and we introduce them because other fish love to eat them. They're like candy to them, right? And so they can go eat a whole bunch of them. But the downside of them is that they grow pretty quickly, and they grow to a point where they're too big for the other fish around to eat. And so when they're really small, they're fantastic, right? They're food source, really, really entertaining to have around. Once they get too big, then they start to eat a lot of the food that we want the other fish, especially other small fish, to be able to eat. So that's a cascading effect where over time we thought this would just be a bunch of candy for the fish, and it ends up being a lot of competition for the fish. So
interesting.
You always say that you think deer and cattle look dumb when you look at them through the video camera.
Yeah.
You'd really think gizzard shad look dumb.
Yeah, go look at a big gizzard shad.
They
do look
dumb
funny.
as anything look.
Just the blank expression of a cow staring at you always makes me laugh.
Yeah.
The deer too. Just the big nose on the end. It looks so dumb.
Yeah, wide angle lens. I bet they look even greater.
Oh yeah. So there's no. I assume aside from just the looking at it, there's no species you think has like a niche that could be filled if we brought them back from ancient times.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's absolutely unfilled niches out there, but bringing animals back to try and fill those unfilled niches. I mean, that's.
Well, that's no. Like if you could though.
No.
No.
There's much better I'd rather we figure out how to feed the world than try and bring back some,
fair.
3-headed cookie monster or something.
Yeah. Speaking of, there's a cookie cutter shark, and it's.
See, you just keep.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not going to Google it, but I don't believe you.
It makes it's a parasitic shark, but they go up and they basically grind a circle hole into whales and seals and things like that. So speaking of cookies, there's I guess the point there is there's already a bunch of cool animals out there, right? So let's focus maybe some of our energies on what we can do to benefit it and promote some of them. I think this dire wolf brings up a good example of some other types of gene editing that might be useful. And so thinking about, I know they're putting it into insects to help insects grow faster or grow bigger so that we can use them as food, right? And so there are opportunities for this type of research or these types of scientific tools to be utilized in ways that can be beneficial. So the dire wolf, it's cool, it gets a lot of headlines, right? But the process there is really beneficial, and even beyond the insects. I mean, we're adding a lot of genetic manipulations to cancer treatments, for example, right? And so there are ways that we can take these tools and use them to help humans and wildlife without recreating animals that are extinct or theoretically some morphological creature that we combine into new things. So it's a cool tool to have, and there are real implications for it. But from my standpoint, quote unquote, bringing back an animal might not be the best use of it.
Well, this stuff has changed agriculture. When I was young, some of the weeds that we had, farmers couldn't hardly deal with them, and it took a whole lot of extra work to go out there and row cultivate. Nobody uses a row cultivator anymore because we got Roundup Ready crops. And that's the same technology that they use to create these fake dire wolves. Just inserting a gene into a plant, and that gene has now allowed it to be resistant to whatever herbicide you want to spray on it. BT corn. Mm-hmm. There's another example of one. We had crop pests that really hammer corn, and that BT bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, had something that was nasty for some of these corn rootworms or something like that, and they just insert that gene, and now you got corn that's not affected by it.
And we're also making it so that we can grow corn, or I'm more familiar with wheat in areas, really dry areas, for example, drought-resistant wheat that can now grow and feed communities of people that would otherwise literally be starving. And so this type of tool, scientific breakthrough, is fantastic. And I even think the direwolf, to some degree, bringing it into the light, right? We're having this discussion today because there's these cute little white fluffy puppies, right? So bringing that into the light, there's a lot of value in that, but we just need to make sure we're talking about the real implications and really what's going on, understanding it's not a real direwolf that's coming back.
I'm trying to remember specifics. There was some bug that they were introducing to an area that's infertile. And so the idea was that it would go and it would mate with all the I don't know if it was males or females, and then they just wouldn't, and it would reduce the population. So they were adding bugs, but it was reducing, and that sounds like it's probably the same thing, where they just made it infertile through the DNA stuff. Or there might be.
Well, they've created mosquitoes that have a gene in them that causes cell death, and so if they go out there and I believe they mate with other mosquitoes, and then their offspring die when they have their first blood meal or something like that. Apoptosis. I remember that I heard that word until I was blue in the face when I was a grad student, but I had to go look up what it meant.
It sounds like the much more accurate version of what I was saying.
Apoptosis is programmed cell death, where we're making cells kill themselves, basically. And we see that, mom that gives birth doesn't need all of the uterus that she had while she was feeding that baby. So it makes sense for your body to go in and get rid of some of those cells and focus that energy elsewhere. So it's really a useful thing to have in our bodies, obviously. Gene drive is another thing, and that's along the lines of what Drew's talking about, where it's not just the individuals or the population. It progresses through multiple generations and can, it could help us fight pathogens and get rid of huge outbreaks of things like malaria. So lots of tools there. We use it in fisheries, and so some of the invasive type fish, Asian carp come to mind, where there's a bunch of them out there, and if we can introduce some fish to help cut down on their ability to have high fecundity, higher reproduction rates, that's something that we would want to do. And so you're absolutely right. That's something that they do, and there's a lot of implications for it too.
But maybe bringing back, quote unquote, bringing back extinct species is probably not the most I guess it gets attention, but it's probably just not the most effective ecological thing to do.
I think there's a lot of steps to do too before we get there, right? And so we're making animals look like animals that we had before. We're a long ways away from being able to recreate a real dinosaur that can run around and gobble you up at night.
Thanks, Danny, for joining us today. You were a good sport and jumped in on short notice and helped drive this conversation. I thought it was a great conversation.
Well, happy to be here. I learned a lot.
Good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us on another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feather. We're happy to have you along, happy to have Danny in the sound booth with us, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for another episode. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.